Thank you. Well, it is a real pleasure of mine to be able to introduce a colleague and friend, Leslie Hadfield. Leslie is the face of our Africana Studies program at BYU right now. She leads Africana Studies here at the Kennedy Center, but does so much more than that around campus, including supporting diversity initiatives and belonging initiatives across campus. Her topic today is culture clinics and cooperatives, building Black communities for change in South Africa. She is the author of 2 books on South Africa, Liberation and Development, Black Consciousness Community Programs in South Africa, which was published in 2016, as well as her new book, A Bold Profession, African Nurses in Rural Apartheid South Africa. And I believe you'll be drawing on some of the research from both of those books today. Leslie is a remarkable scholar and a remarkable contribution to the BYU community, and I can think of few people who are as thoughtful and articulate about what it means to build community across diverse populations than Professor Hadfield. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Hadfield.
Thank you, Quinn, and I'm excited to be here today to channel some of South Africa and South African ideas as part of this lecture series. South Africa is currently facing many challenges, and some are particular to South Africa, others are related to worldwide problems such as the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, depleting energy resources, and drought or climate change. I just grabbed this front page from a major newspaper in South Africa a couple days ago. Politically, there have been high-profile corruption charges and what appear to be corrupt or inept local governments, and this has been disappointing and frustrating for a lot of people who had the expectation that once the apartheid government, the white supremacist government that was in power from 1948 to 1990, 1994, that they hoped that when that ended 30 years ago, that would bring greater prosperity and trustworthy government that was responsive to people's needs. And in some ways, South Africa has experienced the path that many other African countries did as they grappled with what democracy looks like in a post-colonial period. What I find hopeful is that South Africa has had and continues to have a strong civil society. During apartheid, many community, church, school groups, a number of groups fought against white supremacy in various circumstances, and these groups have either continued or have inspired others who take responsibility to build their own communities. So today I want to focus on the impact and the work of the Black Consciousness movement. And I want to start by showing a video about a recent sporting event in Ginsberg, South Africa. And you can see Ginsberg on the map here, that little well, I'm circling Bisho, which is in the Eastern Cape, and Ginsberg is right near Bisho there. And here's a picture of what it looked like a few years ago. So I want to play this video about the Ginsberg Sports Revival Program of December 2022. We'll get some help there in the back. Thank you very much for queuing that up.
Ginsberg is known for having produced world champions. Ginsberg has produced national champions like Zanevula Lefume kwi rugby, Blue Jack Amos kwi boxing, Abo Jack Dolomba, as well as music and soccer. And so for a long time, we then realized that there is nothing happening in Ginsberg. And so we sat down and then discussed that we see the social ills in Ginsberg. We see the use of drugs. We see the use of alcohol. We see gender-based violence. We see crime in Ginsberg. We see unemployment in Ginsberg. And so we said, because there is no sport taking place currently in Ginsberg, and therefore we decided to revive sport, because where there is sport, there is discipline. Where there is sport, young people don't have time to engage in drug and any kind of abuse. And so we said as a committee, let us revive. We spoke to the people in Ginsberg. We have people all over the country, in Cape Town, in Gauteng, in KZN, and many other provinces who contributed toward this initiative. And so we want to thank the community of Ginsberg for this wonderful event. It is not an event, but rather it is a process. It's a program that is starting today. We would like to see young kids playing sport in Ginsberg. We would like to see having a sport body that is going to accommodate all the various sporting codes. We saw this morning we had fun run, we had fun walk, we had touch rugby, we had darts, we had young kids playing. And so we want this to be ongoing. We don't want this to end today. We thank our veterans who have come in numbers to support this event. As you can see, the sport ground is full. Everyone is here. When people are here, it gives them time to move away from any criminal activity, from any gender-based violence, from abuse of any kind of a substance. And so we thank the community of Ginsberg for this initiative. And so we are saying to the King Williamstown, come and join us next year, because we will be having the same event next year. We had veterans from boxing. Blue Jagamos is here, one of our veterans. We had Jack Dolomba, who was part of the Springbok. We have Umveleli Nyakati. We had Uzane Mvulalefume, Opudbetu Abadala. And so we thank you so much to Izolicha TV for being part of this event. We thank you for marketing this event. As you can see, we've got different sponsors who have joined us.
So much appreciate that Ginsberg yonke gave us a support, and also in remembering umalumo wethu that oye wadlalela iteam lena siyayisupporta i-match le imane ziqhubekeka. We wish that it will be an annual event esoloko kucelebratewa a number of people, and so this is our kulisa a number of youth, and in support of it, we will be part of it in annually in supporting the youth and also the older people that are here in the team.
Mna njengosomashishini osakhasayo ndiyabulela kubaququzeleli bale event ngokuthi bayenze, ngoba thina silulutsha laseGinsberg oluhleliyo sitsho sakwazi ukuthi masithengise apha, siphuhlise into zethu esikwaziyo, because siyabhaka senza yonke into kumnandi kuyathengwa. Ingaske yonke le event ithi kanti elekenyaka ingenzeka, because iyouth yaseGinsberg into yesport ibise ingekho, so ngoku siyavuya ngokuthi yenzeke. Sizawutsho sibe interested kwisport, kuzotsho kuphele mhlambi nalento ye-drugs ngoba iyasibulala iyouth yethu. Enkosi.
Okay, we can pause the video now. Okay, I wanted you to hear the young woman who was speaking. Maybe you didn't understand her, but what she was talking about at the end was that their gratitude as youth, that they could come and sell things at this sports day and have alternative activities to address drugs in the community, other things, and she said that she hoped it would happen again next year. And the man at the end here also expresses gratitude and some disappointment that the government doesn't see the power of sport in the community. So I wanted to play this because and hopefully as you were watching this, you thought about things that you've maybe been hearing throughout the semester about community, civil society. If we had more time, I'd like to have a discussion about this, but the things that I see in this example about building a civil society or different efforts is bringing a community together in the spirit of celebration and connection. So they wanted to bring, after the pandemic and other things had been happening, they saw things weren't going on in the community, and so they brought people together in that spirit. And they used sport, which you can see in the film and other ways. It brings positive values and constructive activity to the community. It also just brings fun, which is a nice community, a way to connect. And they were highlighting the people from the community in the past who achieved a number of things, and also bringing people back to the community. And this was their way of addressing some social ills and creating a sense of collective work within the community. So I know some of the people who were the organizers of this event, which is how I found out about it. And I've been involved in, I've spent some time in Ginsburg. And I met the people who are involved in organizing this because of their community work years ago and the work they did with the Steve Biko Foundation, which I'll describe soon. Some of them worked as part of a Ginsburg Youth Council. This was back in 2004 when I met one of them the first time. And I want to highlight what introduced me to them and talk about this inspiration that they had. Ginsburg is the hometown of Steve Biko, who was born there in 1946. And he became one of the best-known leaders of the Black consciousness movement, which rose in the 1970s, and went back to his community to run community projects there when the apartheid government banned him there, which is basically like a house arrest. They sent him there. Biko became involved in student politics when he was a medical student in the late 1960s. You can see a picture of him there standing on the left side. With the general silencing of Black resistance in the 1960s, when Nelson Mandela and his comrades were sentenced to life imprisonment and others went into exile, above-ground anti-apartheid activity on a national level continued with multiracial groups that carried out economic and social development activities. Churches and universities offered more safe spaces to carry on with these activities, and some Black-led, non-governmental, self-help and cooperative groups also continued to work to uplift their own communities. However, those groups generally shied away from overt politics. So these universities brought Black students together where they could discuss their ideas and share their experiences and get involved in student politics. In 1968, a number of these students became increasingly frustrated with the white leadership of these multiracial student organizations, and so they decided to found their own student organization, the South African Student Organization, or SASO, in 1969, and this was an exclusively Black student association. This student organization, which was founded by Steve Biko and Barney Pityana, who I'll quote shortly, gave birth to Black consciousness, which was defined as an attitude of mind and way of life that promoted a positive, inclusive Black identity and a psychological liberation, or an awakening to Black value and Black potential in South Africa. The students challenged the oppressive status quo by hitting at the assumptions that fundamentally sustained that status quo. And they defined that status quo as, quote, the twin problem of white racism and Black acquiescence to it. So Steve Biko wrote that the Black man in South Africa had become a shell, completely defeated, an ox bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. He also is often quoted in this writing that he said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor was the mind of the oppressed. Because if the oppressed believed they were meant for subservience and were inherently inferior, they would not challenge white supremacy. An important part of this movement was its rejection of white liberal help, and that was the term that they used for anyone who was of the white race who was working against apartheid. And it wasn't necessarily that it was bad that they were working against apartheid, but however well-meaning these white people were, they did not have the knowledge or commitment to articulate Black grievance or act in support of Black people's needs, the Black consciousness activists said. Instead, white liberalism was viewed as, quote, an obstacle to independent Black initiative and organization, end quote, because white leadership had the damaging effect of leading Black people to believe they must depend on white people for ideas. So for the Black consciousness activists, Black people working in partnership with Black communities would ensure that organizations effectively address the real rather than the imagined needs of the Black community, as well as build the capacity of the Black community. So these student activists really saw community work as an important way to pump back life into the Black population, to combat feelings of inferiority and increase Black self-reliance. I'm going to quote a few of these student leaders at the time. Barney Pityana, who I mentioned before, said, these community development projects should be not seen only as another opportunity to do a good turn, in the charitable idiom of the Boy Scouts. Unlike political organizations running welfare programs in the country at the time, SASO needed to engage with the people in self-reliance and promote the awareness by Black people of the forces that bogged them down. In his view, Pityana said that changing a people's situation could help them better understand those forces that bogged them down, and then they would understand the need and possibility for change. Former student activist and who became a politician in the post-apartheid period, Pandaleni Nefolovodwe explained, so community work was used as part of making sure that Black people's identity, Black people's self-esteem, Black people's trust on themselves should all come. And then you are able to release a person in society who can compete with others, meaning that this person would not go into society with a sense of inferiority or superiority, but on the same level. Dr. Mampela Rampele, here pictured as a doctor in one of the community projects they ran, said that SASO students engaged in community work because they became quite convinced that the only way we were going to have freedom in this country was to engage in restoring the dignity of people and encouraging people to be their own masters and mistresses, to be agents of history rather than its victims. In the book that I wrote about the community development of the Black consciousness movement, I argue that for these early Black consciousness activists, they define liberation as the ability to imagine and reach one's full potential, and development to them meant giving people the tools to reach that potential. They came to define community development as making a community conscious of their need to undertake a venture jointly, resulting in people undertaking their own schemes geared at corporate action, self-reliance, and self-help. So you see these themes running throughout, and that corporate action being important to that. So throughout my work and my investigation of what they did in the 1970s, I pulled these principles of community work out of the Black consciousness movement. The first, which was their first stated goal, was to alleviate suffering, and they would do that by plowing back what they had gained into the community. This was the term plowing back, and a lot of them went on to universities and they saw the skills that they were gaining and that they needed to take it back to their community. And again, it was for alleviating suffering, but as you've seen through these quotes, that it was also to increase self-reliance and a sense of human dignity. It wasn't just about the projects and alleviating that suffering, but about what happened to people in the process of the project, what happened to the community. And of course, once they dove into these projects, they learned that even if they were Black in South Africa, they didn't understand every Black community intrinsically. And so they learned through their own experience, and they drew on the teachings of Brazil's Paulo Freire's ideas about how important it is to have a dialogue with the community, to listen to and consult the community, and they did research in the community to connect with people and understand what the real problems were. And then in line with their ideology, having that community leadership and cooperation was important. But they also use this term creative interactions, as Dr. Rampele said, that they would find anywhere that they could have resources, finances, human resources to run these programs. And so they ended up actually working with white people. Of course, the leadership was important. Having Black leadership was important, but they would work with anyone who would help them reach their goals. And in my book, I highlight the role of youth, women, and churches. I want to go through 3 major aspects of this and give you some examples so you can see this at work in what they were doing. And I titled it Culture, Clinics, and Cooperatives because I'll look at these different initiatives that they had. Now, culture included religion, and the Black consciousness activists really engaged with Black theology, which I'll allude to in a moment. Music and poetry and the theater also were included in culture, the way people dressed. Sport could be included in this, and a lot of it had to do with the psychological aspect. A lot of what they were dealing with these cultural practices or culture really was connected to that psychological liberation. Malusi Mpumlwana, who became a bishop of the Ethiopian Episcopal Church, explained that the Anglican Ethiopian movement championed the cultural identity of Africa before God and the political space for the recognition thereof. So this was important for him and helps us understand the religious aspect. But having grown up in that tradition, he was attracted to SASO, the student organization that they formed, because it stressed Black self-reliance and taking care of your own business, and honoring what you are and what you have, and taking responsibility for what you can do and become. So activists worked through these ideas, what it meant to be Black in a powerful way in South Africa, what it meant to assert a positive and creative identity, what it meant to be oppressed and liberated through culture, and all these ways. These Black consciousness ideas resonated with poets and theater groups. You can see some of those pictured there. There are plays such as Black on White and Resurrection examined what it meant to be Black and oppressed in South Africa. There are a number of poets who similarly dealt with Black oppression and sought to inspire hope in Black self-imagination or reimagination and self-determination with positive images and themes of resistance and redemption. The activists also influenced literary magazines such as the Staff Writer you see there, which continued into the 1980s. And they drew on music, and you can see the plaque there at the bottom in the middle pulls a phrase from Nina Simone's song, "To Be Young, Gifted, and Black," and this was hanging on the wall of somebody I interviewed. This was, again, a way to be inspired, and fashion was a marker of this new attitude, and a way of life as well as a way to inspire others or spread their message. Black consciousness adherents wore their hair in natural afros and wore dashiki shirts, which were popular in the 1970s, other African-style clothing. You can see the pictures there. Mantuka Maisela, who was a student activist, she made her own clothing with those African prints to promote this. The young women involved especially challenged the status quo with their new hairstyles, and by throwing away skin lightening creams. Historian Mbulelo Mzamani has concluded that Black consciousness effectively used culture as a form of effecting a Black awakening and resisting white supremacy in an oppressive political climate. So this was a powerful way that they did that. Black consciousness activists knew the dire need for healthcare services in Black villages from their own experiences, but many of them were also medical students. And so they had the skills and knowledge to plow back this medical expertise into their communities. And they ran a number of healthcare projects. I'm just going to focus on this one. And this was run by the Black Community Programs Organization, which became the community development organization, professional organization of the movement. Biko ended up working for the BCP, and when he was banned to his home district in 1973, he began to look around for a place to build a clinic. Money from an Afrikaner heiress and connections with the church, the local church there, and an educated elite man in a village led them to build the clinic in Zinyoka, and they named the clinic Zanampilo, which in Xhosa means bringing health. Nurse Ntobeka Molatsane, who is pictured there attending to a maternity patient in the bottom middle there, she started working there in the early 1970s and was instructed by Biko to go and do this research in the community, find out why so many children were dying in the community. This was a real problem. So she made some visits of recent patients and discovered that many women suffered because their husbands, a lot of the men who were able-bodied and in a certain age range, went to work in mines or other big cities, but didn't send enough money home for a number of reasons. And these women had given up on farming. They were really in a difficult situation. And as she discovered this, Molatsane then led her to work with the community on more than just nursing. And this center became a real community health center, not just giving good health that was run by Black people. But what the BCP did in Zinyoka was quite remarkable. Its human and financial resources helped it offer a range of services to address these root causes of ill health in the community. They taught budgeting classes. They taught deep trench gardening classes so that people could garden in this arid region. and make their own food. And they also started a women's craft group. You can see that pictured there on the bottom right hand, with women who could then earn money on their own by selling these crafts. And this had a profound impact on both the psychological state and material circumstances of Zinyoka residents. These wage-earning opportunities combined with health care bolstered the sense of self-worth of the villagers, and I interviewed many of them 30 years later after this. Many of them told me how they adopted higher standards for their village. They expected the government, which ended up taking over the village, or the healthcare center, which I'll talk about later, they expected the government to bring the same services that they had had before. Nondalana, who had been a working janitor in the clinic, said that Biko had taught them that they were human, that black people and white people have the same blood, and so they deserved the same services. Okay. They also ran what I call cooperatives, and these were economic projects that a number of them stemmed from what they called these cottage industries. In another village in the same general area, so the same area that Biko could be around, Black consciousness activists took over a leatherwork project from a priest who was working in the community in the early 1970s. And to help this poor community in a similar situation, he started taking these leather offcuts from a leather factory and would take them to this small group that met in the church, and they would create some things to sell. And as the project grew, keeping up with the materials and marketing problems became a little too much for this priest, and so his colleague suggested that he talked to Biko, who ended up taking over the project with the BCP. And under this BCP management, the home industry expanded into a thriving factory, though small, although it was going to open up a second shift to employ more than 50 people in the village. They hired a skilled craftsman and got proper equipment. So you can see the first picture there on the left. This is when they worked in a small little mud hut next to the church, and then they moved into this other bigger area in the upper right-hand picture there. And the BCP's emphasis on people-centered Black management and Black skills was really central to this economic and psychological uplift that people who worked in the factory experienced. Multiple women I interviewed talked about not only the significant economic gains that they had through their work in the factory, but their sense of self-reliance. Mrs. Sarah Papu, who is in the right smack dab in the middle there by the window in the picture on the left, she worked off the land and had scrimped and saved in the village while her husband was off in Cape Town. They had 7 children to support, and sometimes she had to live off of handouts, as other people in the community remembered. But the factory made a huge difference in her ability to clothe and feed her children and send them to school. Ntombo Mhlaba Mamase, who is pictured on the right in this upper right-hand picture, doing the sewing on that little wallet, she was able to build a house and support her mother through her earnings. And both women later expressed this sense of self-reliance that they wanted to go start their own projects after this project was shut down. The apartheid government saw all of this as a real threat to what they were trying to do to support white supremacy. And just briefly, the security police, they killed Biko during interrogation in September of 1977, and then proceeded to shut down all of these programs. Here's some newspaper articles from the day after they shut everything down. This was a really dramatic time, a dramatic end of an era for people involved, the activists and the villagers. A number of activists later reorganized and started new organizations based on their experience. A lot of them had to do with healthcare initiatives, educational programs, community centers, and agricultural initiatives. So this didn't end Black consciousness community work in 1977, although that was a big blow, but it continued. And I just want to highlight one, the Trust for Community Outreach and Education, which was founded, you can see there, in 1983 by Malusi Mplumwana and his wife Toko Mplumwana, who met as student activists and ended up getting married during that time. And you can see here that the TCOE, it supports a number of different organizations that have a lot of projects that have to do with education, but they've also moved into agricultural projects as they sought to respond to the needs of the communities. The Steve Biko Foundation, which was founded by Steve Biko's oldest son and his widow, also has engaged a lot in community work, and they built an entire center in Ginsburg back in the community there. And it was the Steve Biko Foundation, where I met Mandisi Aplom, and he was the one who told me about this sports day. And so I want to highlight the things that he and those who ran the sports day said were inspiring to them. So Sabela Hlanganisa, he was the first person to talk in the video. He was a student activist in the Ginsburg community in the 1980s himself, and he was involved because of his father's political activism in the Black consciousness movement and the police harassment that his father experienced. Hlanganisa himself was also detained and tortured by the police in 1985, which shows his commitment to building the community and fighting those oppressive elements. When I asked what inspired him, he said that it was his Christian beliefs and the welfare of the community, or welfare of humanity, also his upbringing in Ginsburg, his family, and just wanting to assist young people and not falling into the traps of the day. All of those things inspired him to go back to Ginsburg at the end of last year to help organize the sports revival. For him, Biko was an example of contributing to his own small community. They could see evidence of Biko's work still in the community. And so Hlanganisa said, to us who lived and continue to live in Ginsburg, we did not only read about Black consciousness. This was a lived reality that found us as we grew as young boys and girls. He quoted Biko, his writings, when he said that Black consciousness is an attitude of mind and a way of life, the most positive call to emanate from the Black world for a long time. Its essence is the realization by the Black man of the need to rally together with his brothers around the cause of their oppression, and to operate as a group to rid themselves of the shackles that bind them to perpetual servitude. So he continued to cite the way that Black consciousness is daily compelling us Black people to self-examination, and that we should operate as a collective to remove the shackles that bind us to perpetual servitude. And he said this was economically, socially, politically, all of those aspects of what could be servitude. So he said, Blacks must refuse to be kept poor psychologically and refuse to be exploited. Mandisi Aplom, one of the main organizers of the sports revival that I talked about, explained to me that when they were working at the Steve Biko Foundation, which he did for a number of years, they, quote, preached importance of being grounded in one's community, working with youth and to address community matters from all fronts through available channels, end quote. They also emphasized the importance of role modeling, how important it is to have those positive role models in the community. And one of the outstanding aspects of Biko's history to Aplom was his people-centered leadership. And you can see a couple of his recent articles in the local newspaper where he refers to that leadership. And for Aplom, people-centered leadership requires direct participation in community matters, and that one should be decisive and be honest all the time, have that integrity. The people-centered leaders he grew up with were selfless. They listened and commanded respect without any entitlement. And he gave an example of how when he was going to, in the community, people he had gone to school with, they were good friends, but there was somebody he had gone to school with who broke into a school and stole some equipment. And they turned him in because they felt a responsibility to guard the community resources. So that's part of the integrity that he was talking about. He also talked about the role of sport in a community, which was used to express the plight of Black South Africans on the world stage. There was a big anti-apartheid sports movement that really helped to bring light to the plight of Black people in South Africa and move international bodies to do things to bring apartheid down. And so Aplom said that history is a dialogue between the past and the present. And so they saw how sport had united their community and mobilized them against drug abuse in the past. And they planned the Ginsberg Sports Revival in December when people were home for the holidays. So there are a lot of people around to bring in the role models from outside who'd maybe left the community, and also to have people invested in their community at that time to bring those things back that they had seen from the past. Aplom added that the funding came entirely from the community, nothing from the government. And this was an important point for him. He said, we need a new mindset, or he wrote in the newspaper, we need a new mindset where we all play a part, no matter how small, without expectation of monetary remuneration. So I want to finish by quoting him a little bit more at length about his thoughts on the sports revival. He said, so our community-based sports programs is inspired by Black consciousness philosophy because it still teaches us to be self-reliant and to support one another. It promotes the spirit of oneness amongst us and to play our part in the development agenda of our communities. Like Biko said, material want is bad enough, coupled with spiritual poverty it kills. And when building a new nation, it is not the material things only that should matter so much, but values upon which the new society is built. So the idea is to bequeath to the current generation values of love, respect, and caring for our community. We all have our contribution to make, for collectively we can move our communities away from the predicament they have found themselves in, end quote. You can see he's got the picture of Biko there in the middle of one of his articles. So what does this contribute to the discussion about building a civil society? I would love to hear your ideas and take questions as well, but these are a few points that I brought out in my research and from what Hlanganisa and Aplom said. One, I think it demonstrates the power of youth, women, and churches to shape communities, even in hostile environments, and I saw that definitely in the 1970s. And that also leads to the importance of having a measure of state tolerance. If the state is too repressive, it can cause big problems, and people in development know how important that is. And so if there is an oppressive state, it doesn't mean that it's impossible, but that's where groups will need to step in or step up to challenge that, or where the civil society is really important. But I think the last 3 points here on this slide are probably the most important in this example, and that is one, the importance of this overarching ideology that prioritizes what happens to individuals and communities in the process of this community work or community development. And that is especially for communities who've been oppressed, to have this belief in themselves, to have that community cooperation. And part of the Black consciousness movement legacy is the people-centered leadership is important to that as well. And you need to have that along with a sense of ownership, responsibility, and integrity within the community itself. So I am very pleased that I could be here to share these ideas, and I would love to take questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Professor Hadfield. Lots of things to discuss in there. We have 15 minutes for discussion. If you need to leave in order to get to a 1 p.m. class, you're welcome to do that now, but encourage you to stay if you can. And Abby in the back is going to bring a wireless mic to you. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get you the mic. Stand up and introduce yourself briefly. And again, we will conclude at 1 p.m.
Thank you very much, Leslie. What a wonderful job you have done. I do agree with you that the last 3 points in the slide is the most important. But the question is, what are the drivers of those last 3 points? We know the role of education driving those last 3 points. We know the role of education and adaptation. I was in South Africa the last 3 years twice. The Kennedy Center was unable to support my traveling there with some students. But the key question that I have it is presumed that the education system had been modified or changed. But at the same time, the curriculum remains the same. And the professor or teachers that teaches those, they still have that past colonial mentality. So how do we use education to impact those three last drivers of community building?
Great, thank you for that question. I'm actually going to go back to Mendisi Aplom, who a couple of years ago said, we need to have these aspects in our education. Education for civic engagement, education for a civil society, right? And so I'm not sure where he is at this point, but his idea was, can we create a curriculum or even establish a school that is focused on educating people for citizenship and that civic engagement? So I think if the Steve Biko Foundation made big efforts to include the Black consciousness movement in the curriculum for South Africa a few years ago. This was part of their matriculation exam. There was a question on the Black consciousness movement. So those things can help, but I think having that particular curricular orientation is really important. Yes, thank you.
Hello, my name's Sophie. I'm studying comparative literature and French studies. My question regards maybe other movements. Specifically, I'm thinking about la négritude in like French history and African history. How do you see the connections between these movements and other movements? How is Black consciousness kind of building off the movements of the past for this African sense of independence and community?
Great question. So these Black consciousness activists, as another historian, Dan Magaziner, wrote, he called them philosophers and shoppers in this marketplace of ideas. They knew about the negritude authors. They knew about people like Frantz Fanon. They read people from the continent, Julius Nyerere talking about self-reliance in Tanzania. They read African American authors. And so all of these ideas are definitely part of this idea that they were looking for a psychological liberation for Black South Africans was not necessarily new. There are these Africanist movements within South Africa and across the continent, and especially the negritude movement started in the late 40s and into the 50s, right? So these are people who are looking at the end of colonialism and what does that mean, and grappling with oppression and Africanness and being Black. So they were definitely aware of that, and that influenced their ideas. So we can see this movement as part of that broader collection of ideas, which is really exciting. Yeah, thank you. Yes, over here.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hadfield. I was just curious, in your research with these communities, what are they doing better than we are? I was curious, what can we learn from these African communities that we could implement to make our community better here in the U.S. and here at BYU?
Okay, thanks. It's a big generalization. So I'll just pull lessons instead of maybe saying what there are a lot of things within our own communities to examine, right? One of the things that I think is important is that responsibility that people took on themselves, and to not wait for the government to do something. If we have a complaint about the government, well, let's do something about it, right? We just had daylight saving time that came in. We all complain about it, and we can write to our senators and our congresspeople, our representatives in Congress, because they're thinking about a bill right now. They're debating a bill about what we should do with that. So we can make our voices known. I think also the Black consciousness movement was in a particular time. They were fighting apartheid, so they couldn't work with the government at that point, but it didn't mean, and so they had to look inward, and they didn't have control over the educational curriculum, but they did things on their own to then make it so that the community could rise up and be in that space and use that space. So one of the things that I didn't highlight here that's part of my book is that they created a yearbook where this was, I guess, informal education, right, for their own community. Let's highlight what we're doing in our community so we can see the positive creative agency that Black people have, and that can inspire us, and then we can work together. So having that cooperation, that collaboration on that other level is important as well. But it really requires a sort of an inward-looking process, as they also called it, before then going out to work together. So I think doing multiple things and taking that responsibility are key.
Hey, my question was, you discussed liberation briefly, kind of how that's the concept of people being able to have the opportunity to live their lives how they want. I just wonder, in communities like Ginsberg, if you feel like that vision has come to realization, or in a lot of South African communities.
Great question. So yes, the idea of liberation, meaning that people can imagine and reach their full potential, which I think is a pretty good definition of being liberated, what that means. And I think that you can see a mixture, right? There are people like Aplom, like his colleagues who ran that sports revival. There are others who've gained the education. I think education is also pretty key, who have then said, this is what I want to be, and then they have been able to reach it. Of course, South Africans and a lot of Black South Africans are still hindered because of the economic challenges that are still, South Africa, they ended apartheid, and then a lot of South Africans now talk about transformation. What now does it really mean to be decolonized? What does it really mean to have apartheid gone? And have we actually done that in the education system, in the economy, in who is in the government? And so I see a mixture is, I guess, the short answer to your question. And when we look at people in Ginsberg going back to help their own communities, I think that's a sign that there are strong forces, people who have been liberated and can go back and help others and help their community. But there's still quite a bit. And one of the things that I've heard from a number of my friends in that area is that because of COVID and the economic challenges that brought and other things, that there is a rise in crime in the community, which is one of the reasons why they said we've got to do some more about that. So, still some big challenges.
And so I'm going to ask a question.
Okay.
Because this is interesting to me, which is that what role do you think that sort of political institutions or even institutions like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee have played in sort of building a civil society in the sense that it diminishes conflict among these diverse groups of people?
Okay, so your question is really getting at, we've got diverse groups of people in South Africa. I've been talking a lot about Black communities, and it's true, South Africa is a very diverse country, and racism and white supremacy really had a huge impact on the way that the country went. And so how is it that people are working across these lines now? And what the role of government is versus maybe the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I will start with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was a government program. It was part of a compromise, a political compromise with the transition from the apartheid government to the new fully democratic government. And so there were some political aspects of that for sure. I think that it accomplished a number of things that are pretty key, and that is to bring the truth out. And I think that Desmond Tutu, his book, No Future Without Forgiveness, right? And then the other part of that is no forgiveness without the truth. You need to have that to move forward. And I think that opened up a number of things that the South African society could examine about what happened in the past to move forward. However, there were actually not even the majority of cases of people who applied for amnesty received it. And so even today, there are people, I just was reading an article yesterday about Fort Kalata, who was killed in 1984, 85 with the Cradock 4, maybe it was 86, one of those middle of the 80s. And his son is wanting to prosecute the people who killed his father. And that those people did not gain amnesty in their case, but they were able to gain some peace in knowing what happened, but they would also like some justice. So there's some unfinished business there. And with the political, there have been a number of things that the government has put into place. Some have been more successful than others in trying to help people who were sorely disadvantaged for a number of years gain housing and sources or services in these communities, so Ginsburg could have paved roads and could have plumbing and electricity, those sorts of things. But there are other issues in the private economy and a number of issues with government officials who have seen this as a way to put things in their own pocket. And this is where I see a strong civil society in South Africa being bolstered by those things, but also taking matters into their own hands and making things happen and challenging the government, so that the African National Congress, who's been in power since the end of apartheid, has to stay on its toes. It's not a one-party state. There are a number of other organizations and community organizations working. That's a long answer to your question. Thank you for that question. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's my view. Okay.
Please join me once again in big thank you to Professor Hadfield. Thank you. We appreciate you being here.